Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Finally, I got my haircut. They don't care. We're back here with international trade. I'm very excited because today we're going to start our very last topic of trade policy. Why should we study trade policy? In other words, why should we study the reasons and the effects of things such as tariffs, quotas, and other things? Well, 10 years ago, it would have been a little difficult to motivate that because when we look historically at the patterns of trade policy in the world, what has happened is that ever since World War II, there's been a widespread reduction in tariffs, so much so that tariffs today in most rich economies are very close to zero. They're very, very low. But then a wind against globalization came. We had Brexit, which we talked about last time. We had Donald Trump's tariff wars, the imposition on tariffs on China, who then retaliated. And so for these reasons, we need to study this topic, okay? We want to understand whether what Trump did is a good or a bad thing and why. So this is the outline for the lecture. Today we're going to cover the social welfare and the effects of tariffs for small and large countries. And then next time we're going to study the WTO, look at some articles and study the effects of quotas. And as a last topic for the course, we're going to look at something new. We're going to look at the topic of product quality and how different trade policies can actually affect product quality. And also we're going to look at multi-product firms. But first, what we want to do is to set up a system to understand the effects of tariffs. What we're going to do is to develop a function, which we're going to call the social welfare function, which is going to be the summation of the utility of all individuals in a country. And we're going to use that social welfare function to study the effects of changes in tariffs on the welfare of countries. So let's do that. We're going to consider a quasi-linear utility function, and we're going to do that for each individual, which we're going to denote by H. So this means that each consumer maximizes its utility, which is going to be given by the summation between a quasi-linear good or an outside good, which you're going to denote as C0 of individual H, plus the other part of the quasi-linear utility, which we'll denote as UH of CH. And we should think of CH here as a vector. Okay, so there could be several different products here. It doesn't really, it doesn't matter. And obviously the budget constraint is that our consumption C0H plus the vector of price is P prime, so translated, which multiplies the vector of quantities consumed CH must be less or equal to the income of the consumer, which is IH. So if we set up the Lagrangian, what do we get? So standard Lagrangian, we're gonna consider two first-order conditions. The first one is with respect to the outside good C0 of H. And what is this? Well, this is telling us that 1 equals lambda, And this is the beauty of the quasi-linear utility function, that the lambda, the marginal utility of income, equals 1. So that means that the demand for every good, which is not the outside good, only depends on prices. In fact, if we look at the first order condition with respect to CH, what we have is the partial derivative of UH of CH with respect to CH equals P prime. Okay, so the demand for CH, the inverse demand for CH, only depends on the vector of prices. Now we can invert this. Okay. We invert that, and we're gonna get that CH is just a function DH of prices, P. Now, typically here, I often receive a lot of questions because you may ask, okay, where is this DH coming from? How can you find DH given the first order condition? And the answer is that you can't. You need a closed form expression, a functional form, if you like, for the utility function to find what is the expression of DH. What we're doing here is just to simplify our notation. We're going to think that if we invert the first order condition, we obtain a direct demand function, which we're going to denote in a very general term with the DH. If the utility is a CES, DH is going to have a certain shape. If the utility is, I don't know, linear quadratic, that D is going to be of a different shape. So that is the demand for our regular goods. What about their numeraire? Well, that's C0H, or the outside good, or the quasi-linear good. But that is simply driven by the solving the budget constraint. So C0H equals the income minus P prime CH, which is DHP. And so the income only affects the demand for the linear good. Excellent. So now recall that our objective is to study the welfare effects of changes in tariffs. So to do that, we have to somehow study the welfare, the utility, if you like, of all individuals in the economy. So let's look at the indirect utility function. So we're going to denote that with the capital V of H, and that is a function of the vector of prices P and the income of the individual, IH. And so what is that equal to? Well, if we recall from above, that's C0H plus UH of CH. And so if we substitute in what CH is, we have is IH minus P prime DH of P plus U of H. And then we have the demand for the non-linear good. We have DH P. Great. Now we can we're gonna adopt a utilitarian point of view, and we're gonna consider the social welfare as the summation of this indirect utility function across all individuals. So we're gonna have the social welfare it's going to be denoted by W, of the vector of prices and the aggregate income I, and this equals the summation for individuals from h equals to 1 to capital H of VH P I H equals the summation h equal to 1 to capital H of what? We have all the income IH, we have minus the amount of money you spend on the non-linear goods plus the utility that you get from consuming the non-linear goods. Great. Now we're gonna denote the total income just for completeness. Let me write that capital I is the summation across all individuals of each individual income. And now we're basically done. Okay. So we have defined the social welfare. You see that the social welfare depends on the aggregate income, depends on the prices of all goods, and depends on the demand of each individual for all these goods, and also depends on how the individuals value these quantities consumed, with UH. So when we study the effects of tariffs, we're going to see that tariffs can affect welfare, well, in two ways. Either if they affect the prices, P, or if they affect the income, I. So let's see how income and prices affect the social welfare. So first, let's consider the effects of income on welfare. So if we look at the partial derivative of the welfare with respect to the income, capital I, what is that equal to? Well, that is equal to 1. Right? It's no surprise we have a quasi-linear utility function. That is the reason why we did it. Right? With a quasi-linear utility function, doesn't really matter how the income is distributed across individuals, because if you increase the income, welfare is going to increase, of any individual, welfare is going to increase by the same amount. Perhaps this is not realistic because you could imagine that the marginal utility of income might depend on the level of income, so that richer consumers value less an additional kroner of income than poorer consumers. But here we're just trying to keep it simple enough. We have a very general formulation here where we allow any consumers to have any sort of demand, any sort of utility. We're just constraining the utility to be quasi-linear, and this is what we get. Now, what about the derivative of the social welfare with respect to the price? Well, this equals the summation from h equals 1 to capital H of what? Well, we have minus dh minus p prime derivative of dh p with respect to the price plus the partial derivative of UH with respect to DH times the derivative of DH P with respect to the price. Okay, so this looks a little ugly, but actually it can simplify nicely. Well, this is summation H equals 1 to capital H of minus DH P plus the derivative of our demand with respect to the price, which multiplies the partial derivative of UH with respect to the quantity consumed of each good, DH, minus P prime. Okay, so what is that? What does that give us? Well, let's look back up at our individual first order conditions with respect to the quantity consumed of the nonlinear goods. Now we have that the partial derivative of UH with respect to the quantity consumed equals the vector of prices. And so what do we get? What do we get is that this term here is exactly equal to 0 because of the first order conditions. Okay, and so what this means is that our social welfare function derivative with respect to price equals the summation h equals 1 to capital H of minus the individual demand. And we're going to denote this with simply minus D of P, where D of P is the aggregate demand, okay, the demand summed over all individuals. Now, actually, this result, the fact that the derivative of the social welfare function with respect to the price equals minus the demand for that for the good in question, is actually you didn't need to do this proof in the sense that this is driven by the envelope theorem. But I just wanted to do it longhand to show you that indeed it is the case. But so this is excellent. So basically now we have a social welfare function that we can greatly characterize because we basically, let me write it out here again. What are our results? Well, we have a social welfare function, W of P of I, and I. P is the vector of all prices, capital I is aggregate income, and we know how W responds to changes in income and changes in prices. So if we want to study what happens when we impose a tariff in this economy, we just have to figure out what happens to the income and to the prices. And notice that the way with which individuals value different bundles of goods and differ in terms of their demand does not really matter here, in the sense that so long as the preferences are quasi-linear, and so long as we know what is the aggregate demand, D of P, the individual demands that generate this aggregate demand, this DHP, can be anything. And all we need to know to evaluate the welfare effects of anything really is the aggregate demand, D of P. Now that we have established how changes in prices and changes in income affect the social welfare function, we can make some further assumptions to relate tariffs to prices and income of a country. So first of all, we're going to make our life simple and think that there is only one good. So you can think that this is a non-comparative advantage good that our country is importing. You can also think that perhaps this is a sort of a partial equilibrium analysis. Now we're going to impose a specific import tariff T, right? So that basically the domestic price P equals the world price P star plus the tariff T. Now, a more common tariff is not that of a specific tariff, but that of a ad valorem tariff, where the tariff is a percentage over the value of the import. But here we're just sort of making it simple with this specific tariff. And so this specific tariff is simply saying that if you import this good, you have to pay, I don't know, 50 kroners for every unit of the good that you import. Now, we're gonna, make our life simple and fully exploit the advantages of using the quasi-linear utility function by assuming that the numerator good requires 1 unit of labor, so the wage equals to 1. This is going to be L consumers, so you can think that all these L consumers earn 1 unit of income, so that is the income of consumers. Then there's going to be the income of the government and the income of firms, and all together this make for the aggregate income. What is the we're going to see that we have output here Y, that is the total production of this good, and the total cost is denoted with capital C of Y. We're going to denote imports by M, which is the difference between the demand, the domestic demand for a good, minus the output. Here we're obviously both output and imports depend on price, but we're just making it explicit for the demand because of what we showed you before. What is the government revenue? Well, for every unit of import, the government makes T, the specific tariff, kroners, right? So the government revenue is the tariff times the volumes of imports M. So implicitly, the social welfare is a function of the price P and the aggregate income. What is the aggregate income? What is the income of consumers, capital L? It would be L times W, but W is 1, the wage is 1. Then we have the government revenues, TM. Then we have the profits of firms. And so the price times the output minus the total costs. All right, so this basically captures the 3 main agents that are affected by the tariff. We're going to look at consumers, we're going to look at the government, and we're going to look at firms. Well, basically what we're going to see is that the effect of the tariff actually differs across these 3 different groups. So let's study how the social welfare is affected by a change in the tariff. We need to write down just a few expressions here just for our clarity so that I can reference them later on. First, we said that the price of our home good equals the foreign price P star plus the tariff T. Also said that the imports are gonna denoted by M equals to our domestic demand dP minus our output Y. Government revenue is TM, and the social welfare W is implicitly written as a function of the price, which again is a function of the world price and the tariff. And then we have the aggregate income, TM, plus TM is the government revenue, and PY minus capital C of Y is the firm's profits. So if we want to study the effects of a change in tariff on the welfare, we need to take the derivative, the total derivative of the welfare function with respect to tariff. So if we think this is just a function of t, so what we need to do is to take derivative So let's take this derivative of the welfare function with respect to the tariff. So dw dt, well, that is equal. Recall that the social welfare function is basically a function of the price and the income. So dw in dt is, well, the partial derivative of the welfare function with respect to the price times the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff plus the derivative of the welfare function with respect to the income times the derivative of income with respect to the tariff. So let's do this. The derivative of the welfare function with respect to the price, we said it equals minus the aggregate demand, D of P, for the good in question. So we have there is minus D of P times the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff plus we also said that the derivative of the social welfare function with respect to the income, capital I, equals 1 because we have a quasi-linear utility function. And so what does that mean for us? Well, that means that here we have 1 times the derivative of income with respect to the tariff. What is the income? Well, the income is this object here. So let's take this derivative. So derivative of L does nothing. Then we have T, the derivative of the imports with respect to, let's write it fully with respect to the price times the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff plus the imports, M, plus the derivative of the price in the tariff times Y plus price times the derivative of Y with respect to the tariff minus C prime of Y, so the marginal cost, right? Cy is the total cost, C prime is the marginal cost, the derivative of total cost, times dy dt. So here we have this sort of long expression. We can change a lot of things here, and that's what we're going to do. The objective is to express this in ways that are sort of intuitive. So that's what we're going to do. So first of all, what we're going to do is put together our terms, these two terms that are expressed as a derivative of dp in dt. So we have that derivative of the price with respect to the tariff equals minus dp plus y then we have our tariff times dm dp dp in dt plus m, and then we have, let's bring these two terms together. So let's factor in the terms that have the derivative of output with respect to the tariff, so that we get, the price minus the marginal cost times the derivative of y with respect to the tariff. Okay, so what are we gaining from this? Well, what we're gaining is that this term here, what is that? Well, that is the output minus the demand. Oh, we add it over here. And the output, sorry, the demand minus the output equals the imports. And so this object here equals minus m. And so then we have a term m here. We have a term m here, And so we're going to bring them together. So we have is m, which multiplies 1 minus the derivative of price with respect to the tariff, plus t dm dp dp dt plus p minus c prime of y dy dt. We're almost there, guys. We're almost there. So what is this object here? 1 minus the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff. Well, here we should open a little parenthesis. Okay, let me denote this with orange. Perhaps we can't really see orange, so let's go with red. So we saw before that the price, domestic price, equals the export price, P star, plus the tariff. So the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff equals the derivative of the world price with respect to the tariff plus 1. So this means that 1 minus dp dt equals minus dp star dt. And that closes our parenthesis. So what that means is that our derivative of the social welfare function with respect to the tariff equals, well, minus m dp star dt plus tdm dp dp over dt plus p minus c prime of y, which multiplies the derivative of the output with respect to the tariff. It's just great, because here what we have is 3 different components to this derivative. And now we're gonna go back to the slides and look at the interpretation for these components. But the way that we're gonna write it is just in a different order, and that will become apparent in a few slides. So that dw dt equals, the first term is gonna be t times the derivative of imports with respect to the price times the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff minus imports times dp star in dt plus p minus c prime of y dy dt. Great. So this is the expression that now we're gonna study a little bit more. And so this is the formula that we have just derived. So we have that the change in welfare due to a change in tariff is made of 3 components. The first component is a so-called deadweight loss. Okay, that is the efficiency cost of the tariff. Basically, you can imagine that the change in the imports is equivalent to a change, to a moving along the demand curve and the supply curve. And so what that basically is the deadweight loss that you always generate when you impose a tariff in a perfectly competitive market. What you cause is that there's going to be a substitution effect whereby consumers will buy less of this good in response to the tariff and buy something else. And furthermore, we're going to create some inefficiency costs because some inefficient firms will now be able to produce the good. So that is the deadweight loss term. Then we also have a terms of trade effect. So basically what this means is that the tariff can affect the world price. You can think of this as, if you impose a tariff, you're going to reduce your demand for a good, and if you're large enough, that reduction in the demand is going to cause a reduction in the price. If you reduce the world price of a good, you are improving your terms of trade. You are improving recall we define this as the ratio of export price to import price. If the price of the goods that you import decline, that is a good thing. That is an improvement for your terms of trade. And finally, what we have is the change in the industry profit margin, right? That we have the price minus the marginal cost. And so that is basically capturing the effects of the tariffs on firms. Great. So let's now look, let's try to apply this formula for some canonical cases. And let's start with having perfect competition and a small economy. So if we have perfect competition, the price always equals the marginal cost, Cy. So that this last term in our expression always equals 0. If we have a small economy, the world price is unaffected by the tariff. And so what we have is that our derivative of the social welfare with respect to the tariff equals just that weight loss term, dm dp dp dt. Since the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff equals the derivative of the world price with respect to the tariff plus 1, and dp star in dt equals 0, well, that means that dp in dt equals 1, and therefore what we have is that our social welfare function for a small economy, the derivative of that with respect to the tariff equals the tariff times dm dp. We derive that the change in welfare equals the tariff times the change in imports due to a change in price. And so the change in price due to the tariff. And we know that the derivative of imports with respect to price is negative, is because if the price increases, the domestic demand declines. So you can imagine, given a total output that you produce, you demand less, you need to import less. And furthermore, the increase in price is also going to increase the output that the domestic economy produces. Right? The supply is upward sloping, so that's why. And so since you demand less and you produce more, the difference between demand and supply shrinks, and so you need to import less. So if this derivative on the right-hand side is negative, it means that an increase in tariff is going to reduce welfare. And so what that means is that the optimal tariff is 0. If you are a small economy, you should not impose tariffs. An imposition of tariffs reduces welfare. If we look at a simple supply and demand graph, we can actually very quickly describe what happens here. Here we have on the left-hand side the home market with your domestic supply S, domestic demand capital D, autarky point at point A. You can see that at world price of PW, we were producing S1 and demanding D1. The difference between these two terms were the imports. Right, so we are a small economy, so although the imports decline in the price, we're basically facing an horizontal supply curve. What does that mean? Well, that means that if we change our import demand, we're not going to affect the price. And that's the definition of a small economy. Takes the world prices as given. If you remember, we did that in the actual limit model, in the very first lecture of the actual limit model, so long ago. So if you impose a tariff, you shift up the export supply curve, X star. As a result, you increase the price to PW plus T. Your imports decline. You produce more, go from S1 to S2. You demand less, from D1 to D2. What happens to welfare? Well, the consumer surplus, the area between the price and the demand curve shrinks. Consumers lose this trapezoid, A plus B plus C plus D. That whole area goes away. So consumers are worse off. What about producers? Well, the producer surplus increases. We go from the area between the price and the supply curve shifts up, right? And the producer surplus increases by the area A. There's one last piece here, and that is the government. The government gains the government revenues because this tariff is indeed a tax that the government collects. And so what is the government revenue? Well, it's the imports, D2 minus S2, times the tariff, T. And so that is the rectangle represented by the area C. If you sum the two positive effects on producers and governments and you subtract the reduction in the consumer surplus, you find that there is a loss in the home welfare of these two triangle areas, B and D. And that is the standard deadweight loss, okay, the inefficiency caused by tariffs. So you may wonder, why would small economies impose tariffs? There's a lot of countries that are small economies and have tariffs, right? You can imagine, Denmark used to have tariffs before it entered the European Union. So why would they do that? Well, you may think, okay, perhaps the government wants some revenue. And, you may think that that's idiotic, but actually this was one of the main sources of revenue back in the day, 100 years ago, when the income tax wasn't as widespread as it is today. And so the only way for governments to raise money was through tariffs. Then you may think, okay, perhaps the politicians are idiots. They don't know that they're causing a deadweight loss. That does not sound right. If we're economists and we think that people make rational decisions, we should try and find what are the incentives of these decisions. And here what we're saying is that consumers are worse off, producers are better off. So if you're imposing a tariff, perhaps that is due to the fact that the policymaker cares more about the producers than it does about the consumers. Perhaps that is because consumers have a hard time advocating for their rights, right? And also it's very difficult for them to sort of create a unified front, right? A unified group. Whereas for companies, especially the big ones, it's much easier to lobby in favor of these tariffs. Okay, so that is perhaps a reason to justify why small economies would still impose tariffs, even though they're costing economically to their countries. Now, interestingly enough, there's a very recent research from economists from the University of Brussels that actually has shown that these days the large economies actually lobby in favor of globalization. Okay? So that's sort of different thing. Okay, so let's now look at what happens with large economies. The derivative of the world price with respect to the tariff is different from zero. And so, and in particular, we're going to see that it's less than zero because increasing a tariff is going to reduce your world demand. And as a result, if you're large, the reduction in demand from you is going to cause a reduction in the world price. But so this means that for a large economy, our social welfare equals so what is the optimal tariff? Well, the optimal tariff, let's call it T star, well, it's going to be given by setting the welfare function to 0. So that is n dp star in dt divided by dm dp dp dt. What we established is that positive tariff is actually optimal for a large economy. Obviously, we don't want a huge tariff, we want a small tariff. Now, let's see how this looks like in our demand and supply diagram. So we see here that the main difference relative to the small economy framework is that the export supply curve is now upward sloping. That is because changes in the import demand are going to affect the world price because we're a large economy. So at the beginning we are at PW, then we impose a tariff, the export supply curve shifts upwards. There's a new equilibrium at point C. That is the new price that we face in the domestic economy. Okay. So the price goes from PW to P star plus T. We'll go back to the PW P star difference, okay? So what happens to the consumer surplus? Well, just like before, we lose the areas A, B, C, and D. Producers, well, they're better off, just like before, in that the world price jumps up. And it goes from, and so the producer surplus increases to by A. What about the government? Well, here we have to reflect a little bit with respect to what is the effect of the tariff on the price. Because as you can see here, the fact that the export supply curve shifts up and that causes a higher price, well, this is actually showing that the price received by the exporters, which is the new price P star plus T minus T, is actually lower than the world price that we've seen before. In other words, the imposition of the tariff actually causes the exporters to reduce their price. The large economy is large. By imposing a tariff is de facto reducing the world demand, and by doing that, it's reducing the world price of the good. Another way of seeing this is that the large economy is de facto making the exporters pay for part of the tariff. And as a matter of fact, the government revenues are no longer the area C, but actually it's the area C plus E. That's because the difference between P star plus T and P star is this one, right? And that is the height of our rectangle, and that should multiply the base, which is D2 minus S2. And so the area C plus C is the government revenue for the large economy. I understand here that when you actually sum these differences in surpluses, what is happening is that the welfare effects of the tariff is sort of a priori ambiguous. Here we have that E is the extra effect of the tariff on government revenues, is you have that minus the two deadweight losses, right, B and D. And so if we choose the optimal tariff, what basically happens is that this difference is positive. We can see that in this figure. Basically, with a free trade, we are at point B. If we increase the tariff and we're a large economy, we actually make an improvement in welfare that is maximized at the optimal tariff, where this terms of trade effect, the fact that you're making exporters pay for part of the tariff, outweighs the deadweight losses. And then if you impose too high tariff, the welfare improvements decline. And, you know, it could be at such a high tariff such that you go back to autarky. If you go back here, if you impose a tariff which is high enough and the export supply curve does not cross your import demand curve anymore, well, then you go back to autarky. Okay, so now here I'm already showing you that the optimal tariff is inversely related to the export supply curve, but let's actually see that. So this is the formula for the optimal tariff that we derived before. And now we're going to rearrange it a little bit to develop something that gives us a little bit more intuition. So first of all, you know, notice that imports equals exports. Right? The import of our home economy equals the exports of the foreign economy. Here we have like this is not even trade balance. This is an accounting identity. Right? The imports of Denmark from Germany equals the exports of Germany to Denmark. So this is basically saying that our imports equal the foreign exports that we denote by X. So this means that the derivative of M with respect to the tariff, which we wrote it as the derivative of M with respect to the price, times the derivative of the price with respect to the tariff, right? This is dm in dt. Well, this equals dx in dt. Okay? And so if we substitute this into our formula, what do we get? We get that T star equals, well, M, we can substitute it for X. We have X, dP star in dt over dx in dt. Okay, now we can cancel out the dt's. And so what we get is x dp star over dx. Okay, does that help us? Well, let me put it this way. Let's divide both sides by p star. So t star over p star. So we're expressing the tariff as a function of the world price, which kind of makes sense, right? Here we're having this specific tariff where, you know, to import any unit of a good, you pay 10 kroners. You understand that that doesn't really make any sense, right? In other words, you don't know whether that is a big number or a small number. Like, is 10 kroners a large tariff or a small tariff? Is a small tariff if we're talking about imports of airplanes, is a high tariff if we're talking about imports of, I don't know, 1 gram of coffee. So what we're doing here is basically expressing the tariff as a percentage of the world price, which is more intuitive. And so what we have is, so we have x dp star over p star dx. So I think you're now seeing where I'm going with this. And so if we write it in the reciprocal term as dx in dp star times p star over x minus 1. Well, what is this? This is the reciprocal of the export elasticity with respect to the price. So if we let E star of x denote this elasticity, what we have is that our optimal price as a function of the word price equals 1 over the export supply elasticity. You see here the export supply elasticity, given that the supply is generally speaking upward sloping, if that is a positive number, that means that the world price, sorry, that the optimal tariff is a positive number. And so actually you can drive further intuition for the previous result, because with a small economy, the export supply is horizontal, and that's what we saw in the figure above. And so if the export supply is horizontal, that means that the export supply elasticity is infinite, because if you increase the price, you get an infinite increase in the supply. If you reduce the price, you get reduction of the supply from a positive number to 0. And as a result, for the small economy, the optimal tariff was 0. 1 over infinity is 0. All right, so this makes a lot of sense, because this is saying, we said that the extent by which a tariff can improve welfare in a large economy depends pretty much only on the export supply elasticity, on how sensitive the supply is to changes in prices. Why is that? Well, because the welfare effects of a tariff in a large economy depend on the ability of the large economy to reduce the world price. In other words, to make the foreign exporters pay for the tariff. You know, when Donald Trump was saying, oh, if I impose the tariffs, foreign companies are going to pay for it, that was true. We saw above that when a country imposes a tariff, consumers generally pay most of the costs, but when you're a large economy, you can also force, it's not like you force it by law, right? You force it by market forces. By imposing the tariff, you force the foreign exporters to reduce the pre-tax, the pre-tariff price, and as a result, they are gonna pay part of the tariff. So if a foreign exporter would like to, has a very low export supply elasticity, that means that, you know, basically that exporter would like to sell the same quantity no matter the price. So if you impose a tariff, in order to sell the same quantity, he has to greatly reduce his pre-tariff price. So what you want to do is, sort of like, if you have to put a tariff, right, if you have to impose a tariff on some good, the less idiotic way to do so is to impose the tariff on those products or on those sectors in which the export supply elasticity is low. Because in those cases, the exporters will bear most of the tariff costs, and so the welfare in your economy can increase. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Ciao.